American women should do more in their movement. And in the fall of 1910, Blatch's Equality League of Self-Supporting Women changed its name to the Women's Political Union, and they adopted the colors of purple, white, and green, the same as the WSPU. And this organization borrowed a lot of tactics from the WSPU, and they'd have Sunday teas like the others did. All right, now, we're pulling this together. American suffragists continued to adopt British tactics. Blatch said we should do a parade in the United States. And so American women started using parades. They had their first large suffrage parade in New York City in 1910 in May. It was considered a great success. They start now doing it even more. They're riding on the sidewalk with chalk. They're using sandwich boards to, again, advertise their cause. British posters were displayed at meetings and sold at fairs. The adoption of use of suffrage colors and banners by the Americans continued. We're using a lot of the same things that the British had used. Suffrage songs, which you can still get today, were exchanged between the British and American movements, and some of those songs have this music that makes you just want to march with them. All right. Suffrage shops selling various kinds of merchandise operated in both countries, and in both countries the suffrage newspapers publicized all of these features, and by 1911 an entire suffrage culture had developed which was shared by the British and American women. And because Britain was considered to be the storm center of the suffrage movement, the American audiences were eager to hear on first-hand accounts of the sensational aspects of the British campaign, and a lot were curious. So Ethel Snowden kept doing her speaking tours. In January of 1911, Sylvia Pankhurst came to the United States on a speaking tour. The Women's Political Union sponsored Sylvia Pankhurst's first speech at Carnegie Hall. Blatch made a lot of preparations, and afterwards Sylvia Pankhurst spoke in American cities. She spoke to state legislatures in Colorado and Michigan and in Iowa. So these people are coming and making things. Emmeline Pankhurst came on her second fundraising drive in October of 1911. And her visit coincided, and listen to what's happening now, a major triumph in the American movement. In October, California voted for woman suffrage. So California has the vote, okay? And again, the crowds are enthusiastic, and Pankhurst spoke a lot of times. Emmeline Pankhurst spends Christmas in Seattle. She goes home in January of 1912, and Sylvia Pankhurst comes for a second meeting tour in 1912 too. All right, and we're pulling it together now. You notice it's 1912. This is not going to go beyond 1914, so I'm almost there. In 1912, the Pethick Lawrences visited her brother in British Columbia, and afterwards they went to Vancouver, then to Seattle, and they were welcomed by Washington women who had gotten the vote. Emmeline Pethick Lawrence addressed both houses of the Colorado legislature. In New York, the Pethick Lawrences were honored at a reception in the National Association headquarters, and there was a big reception. All right, and now we get to the part that many of you are familiar with in the movies, okay? The Pethick Lawrences had expressed great concern over the escalating militancy, and upon their arrival back in Britain, Mrs. Pankhurst threw them out, Emmeline Pankhurst threw them out of the WSPU. You're gone, okay? And in October of 1912, Emmeline Pankhurst declared war on property. And in this inflammatory speech, she said, "It has never been, nor will it ever be the policy of the Women's Social and Political Union to endanger life. It is through property that we will strike the enemy." And she urged the WSPU, be militant in your own way. And she concluded, "I incite this meeting to rebellion." So most of you know this from the movies and the books, okay? During the next years, the militants cut telegraph and telephone wires. They would ruin the mail. They would either set the mailbox on fire, or they'd throw ink in the mailbox, or they'd put acid in the mailbox. They would break windows, okay? They would ruin golf courses by either cutting or burning or or putting acid on the grass, okay? They would burn empty buildings. They said, we're never going to hurt a human being, okay? All right, but we can burn a building, okay? And there were some public buildings and some museums and some art galleries that just simply closed their doors because they did not want anything destroyed. Alice Paul returned to the United States in 1910, and Lucy Burns returned in 1912. In 1913, the National Association approved a congressional union for woman suffrage to try to gain support for a federal amendment. The congressional union was headed by Alice Paul, and later in February of 1914, the congressional union and the National Association split and went their own ways. You know that we're coming to the end. So in February of 1913, Emmeline Pankhurst received a 3-year sentence after being found guilty of inciting the destruction of David Lloyd George's house, which was under construction. And a new wave of militancy went through Britain. There were all kinds of denunciations and defenses of the militancy that was in the American, that would be in the American newspapers, all these things going on. All right, and then you get to this question: do you want her to come back again? Okay, and we're getting to the end of this. Okay. Then in September of 1913, it was announced that Emmeline Pankhurst would again visit the United States. And this announcement set off a number of controversies, one being, in view of the extreme violence of those people, how would Americans accept her? And some indicated she would not be welcome. Others said, well, we wish she'd stay at home. And others said, well, I want to hear what she's going to say. So more than any other Pankhurst tour, this 1913 trip posed a dilemma for the American suffragists. And many thought that Pankhurst would hurt the movement here. Alva Belmont, who had become very close to Emmeline and Christabel, hosted her. And as usual, Blanche's Women's Political Union gave a welcoming banquet for Pankhurst. And this is a speech that's always quoted in the books that I used at Spring Hill, because this is a speech that's always in, it always has the title, Why We Are Militant, and they read it as their primary source, okay? But it says, at the Madison Square Garden speech, okay, Mrs. Pankhurst delivered a speech on why we are militant. Now, it is a great speech, okay, and she goes after everything, and she talks about the plight of women, she does all of this. Okay, on the platform with her were women who had served time in British jails, including Lucy Burns, okay, and Elizabeth Freeman. Pankhurst visited a number of American cities. Lucy Burns introduced her in Baltimore. In Washington, D.C., Alice Paul and Emmeline, this is an interesting quote, Emmeline Pankhurst appeared on the stage and they were greeted with lots of applause. And again, Paul introduced Pankhurst, who then praised Paul and Lucy Burns. And she said, I take great, talking about Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, I take great pride in them because in a way they are children. They learned a great deal of organization in the ranks of the Women's Social and Political Union, the organization that I have the honor to represent today. And later in the speech, Pankhurst said, how can you distinguish me from Miss Paul, for instance? I am militant. Miss Paul is not, so far. And so everybody started laughing. Okay. All right. While Emmeline Pankhurst was in the United States, the respectable American magazine Good Housekeeping began a series on the British militant movement, and Alva Belmont she did an introduction to the series. And from January to July of 1914, Good Housekeeping published My Own Story, supposedly written by Pankhurst, but it was in fact ghostwritten. Okay. Generally speaking, now you notice we're in 1914, so we're getting there. Okay. Generally speaking, the spring of 1914 was not a great period of interaction between the British and American movements. A few isolated individuals were still working in the British movement, but not many Americans were still working in the British movement. Since the advent of extreme militancy, only a few Americans were participating in WSP activities. And some of this had because there was new life in the American movement, and Millicent Fawcett's group was making progress too. And so the extreme militancy of the last 2 years of WSPU drove a wedge between some people. And so, again, the suffragettes were sort of doing their own things. And then you all know what happened, and then I'm pulling this together. The outbreak of World War I in August of 1914 brought an end to the extensive interaction between the British and American movements, as most British suffrage organizations suspended activities during the war. We're not going to continue with the war going on. The suffrage victories come later. In February of 1918, British women who were 30 years, this is in the war, still going on, but it's toward the end of the war, February of 1918, British women who were 30 years and older and who were taxpayers, the wives of taxpayers or university graduates, received the vote. And later in 1928, British women who were 21 and older received the vote. But let's talk about the United States, and I'll pull this together. In the United States, Carrie Chapman Catt became president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association in December of 1915. Her winning plan, that's what it was always called, provided a strategy for the national organization. And the Congressional Union merged into the National Woman's Party, which Alice Paul had organized in 1916. And some members of the National Woman's Party picketed the White House. You've seen pictures of those women standing in front of the White House. Many of them were taken to jail, and then, as you know, some of them, particularly when you talk about, again, just across in Virginia, where a number of those people were imprisoned or forcibly fed. But the American movement never had the extreme militancy that you found in the British movement. and American women won the vote in August of 1920. So, pulling it together, beginning in the 19th century, many ties bound the British and American movements together. And these links influenced, encouraged, and motivated suffragists in both countries in their long campaign for the vote. So it's a long campaign, but you see the results of it.